Welcome everyone, Dr. Thor here. Get ready for Gnosis. Well, I'm going to explain to everybody the real facts about Europe yet again. And we're going to talk about World War II, which was really just a few weeks past. It's only been about 70 years when hundreds of millions of people were murdered, and this trait continues. Now, I will quote, I believe, Thomas Jefferson, who said there's two ways to enslave countries: guns and debt. And of course, when guns don't work, you use debt, especially when you have a bunch of worthless cowards, otherwise known as Europeans. So, what happened? If people need to understand what is really going on and what happened back then. Well, first of all, you have the united front of the Russian-German Islamic Federation, and they were in charge and have been since the beginning of the 1900s when these fractions got together. Factions. So the whole idea is that first of all, you need to understand that so-called Nazism was nothing more than a gang that had the exact same beliefs as Marxists. They were just gangs with different colors, kind of like the Bloods and the Crips. What's different about them? Their name. That's about it. So they were two very similar groups fighting together. Now, after all, a lot of people don't understand. They think that Nazism is some sort of right-wing belief system. Well, it's not. It's called National Socialist. Does socialist give you a clue? Those bozos out there that follow these people. And it's very important to understand the entire reality of it. So this is part one, and we're going to be going into several parts here. But we'll try and keep them down to half a bite of a pizza instead of the whole. So first of all, these were two competing powers. Now, the Nazis and the Russians got together and drank a vodka and bad beer and said, "We are brothers! Oh, we all live together!" Of course, in the very typical German way. They all pat you on the back, smile in your face as they build their weapons to attack you later. And this was a big treaty. And you got to remember, the Germans had a treaty with the Russians, and they were buddies. And of course, being the ignorant buffoon cowards that they are, they couldn't figure out that, fighting on all fronts is kind of a bad idea. Not that they could ever possibly win, because they just didn't have the manpower, the resources, etc. Or did they? First of all, they didn't need to have them. They have their federation. Now, from day one, Germans, who are actually Iranian Arabs, are heavily connected to their cousins, otherwise known as the Turks. They assisted in the sack of Constantinople. They assisted in the murder of 1.5 million Armenian Christians because those are their buddies. Modern Germany has 22, could be as high as 40% of the population is Arab, and most of those are, of course, Muslims. They're buddies. If you look at a German, he looks exactly like an Arab, except his skin is a bit whiter. Simple as that. That is their racial characteristics. They have big noses, brown hair, brown eyes, and fairly large ears. They look Arabic, and I will be posting pictures of this so you kind of get it. Because these are not people that are in any way classified, and these stupid idiot white supremacists use the term Aryan, which means Arab, because the Germans use it. Because the Germans never use the term white. They are not Caucasians, they are not white, and there are whole different groups throughout Europe. And the ones that settled in Central Europe, where Germany is, people don't understand that's Central Europe, were Arabs. And they claim the Indians, the Tibetans, and every other little group they can find along the way. And of course, they speak an Arabic language. They put their words together like that. If you speak Old Iranian, it's very similar to German in many ways. And so this is a fact. Now, you don't want to believe that or not. All you have to do is look at German writings, how they push all their words together, just like the Arabs. Does anybody else in Europe do that? Not at all. No, only the Germans push all their words together. That's right. And they have the same kind of that you get from all the Arabic-speaking countries. It's almost identical. Now, it's very important to understand that in ancient history, people have to understand that there was this huge area called Germania, which included France, Belgium, Germany, a whole bunch of areas of Europe. So it is not Germany. Germany is a Western term. Germans call themselves Deutschlanders, which means it's an Arabic word for people of the soil. So the whole idea is that everyone needs to understand that. So you have this federation that's going on because they were the big groups. But you got to remember, two gangs aren't going to get together. What do the Bloods and the Crips do? Well, they kill each other. You know, they've had treaties and everything else. All of these have been broken because one side or another causes trouble. And this is exactly what happened. So the Germans weren't going to allow a competing gang to exist there. So they weren't going to do that. So plain and simple, and of course because of the usual weak-kneed, unprepared attitude of particularly Britain and of course the French, who lost their entire country in 30 days, because they were kind of tired after World War I. An entire generation was lost. A mustard gas invented by the Germans had killed tens of thousands of people, and the Germans were ready to keep fighting. It wasn't 2 years after World War I, they were already rearming to start another war, while everybody else was kind of pulling back. And of course, the weak-kneed French, who allowed all the, even this happened, which of course today they're the poodle of Germany, didn't go in and enforce any of the non-arming of the Germans after World War I. Nobody wanted to go back and fight. This happened in World War II as well. Where but of course it's very complicated. You even have the Nazi traitor known as George S. Patton, who had made pacts with the Germans in the Olympics, and I believe it was 1913 or something. All of these things I'm going to release and give the information on it, which I allege is the truth, getting from a person I worked with and who I've done my research myself. But this is another interesting area we'll get into. But you got to understand that it's this federation, and people seem to think that it was Germany against the world. Well, it wasn't at all. They had many allies. The Turks have been their allies since since they assisted them in the conquering of Constantinople and murdering the Christians there. And they've been working with them consistently as to gain their support, because they know that's what they are. Now, I don't know why people are confused about this, and of course, the Deutschlanders, the Deutschies, don't get it themselves. They think they're somehow some sort of other people when they're easily traced back to their Arab origination. And now most of them are even stating this, like the Nazi runist Edred Flowers, who now states he's studying Iranian history because that's where he comes from as a, quote, German. The little Texas turd that he is. So the whole idea is that this is a reality that people need to understand. They are not Nordics, blonde-haired, blue eyes, which are a particular type of Nordic Celtic types, and the original, quote, white people. And this is just a statement of history. I have no use for anybody, particularly. So, and certainly I don't have any use for the Germans, the Russians, the Americans, or anybody else. So the human race is a scum race that should be eliminated by extraterrestrials, as far as I'm concerned. But the facts are the facts. Now, the Celts and everybody else, these are all your, quote, Caucasian people. Or what you would consider white. The original whites also were the Greeks and the Italians, the Etruscans. You're talking about the Welsh. You're talking about the Basque. All of these different cultures were original people that you could consider white. Now, there's problems with all this that people don't understand the history. So let's go through this and make sure that everybody gets it right. All you got to do is read. Nothing do I state can't be verified by numerous third-party sources. So the whole idea is that's a whole different culture. Now, you've got to remember that since basically the Deutschlanders have always been enslaved, beaten, ran away from everybody, that there's a great mixture of people, particularly in Central Europe. But you'll find this everywhere in Europe to a degree. People, while they don't mix that much, they did mix. And there is a mixing culture, particularly with the Germans, who are beaten every single time they were ever met. So you have fake religions they believe in. Oh, this stuff about Donner and other things. This is all nonsense. And of course, they use their Arabic terms, not the Nordic terms that use Odin and Thor and these kind. No, Donner, Woden, all this kind of things. So, and then, of course, they were forced by the Romans to adapt Christianity to try and subdue their perverse ways. So the whole idea is it's very important to understand that. So they're whatever so-called, they are not a Deutschland. Your average Deutschlander has no Nordic blood in them whatsoever. They're Central European Iranians. And whoever else conquered and screwed them to produce children, which is this whole group of things you have out there. So Europe is like the United States. It's a bunch of people pressed together. It's amazing that every country has different languages. We also need to understand that Deutsche and its Arabic roots are just that. How come nobody else in Europe speaks that language? How come nobody else pushes their words together? How come you have such diverse Latin-type languages, such as Italian, Spanish, French, very different languages, and they write differently. Everything is different. Only the Germans push their stuff together like that to imitate their Arabic heritage. So no one else does that. So the whole idea is this is the culture, and if you look at Old German and you look at a page of that, it looks identical to Arabic writing because it's such a diffused and really bizarre way of writing, very much away from the Roman tradition, which has converted all of Europe, and everything that we have in Europe and almost the world is based on the Roman Empire, who did things right, plain and simple, and ruled most of the world for 600 years. So all of that needs to be quite understood. You've got to remember that these tribes of the Goths, the Visigoths, the Western Goths, who begged the Romans to settle in Spain, and all the other them ran from every particular invader there was there. They begged them because of invaders of the Huns, Genghis Khan, you name it. They were constantly running from these invaders who could easily beat these weaklings that never did anything. So we run into all sorts of problems here of understanding this. So they have this very close connection to and have highly embraced the Arabic world because they understand what they are. Now you need to understand that. You need to look at a map of Europe and see where Turkey is and how it is an Arabic country. So that's all part of it. They have taken over what was Rome, killed all the Christians and took over that country, and that's okay. More short-handed history. And certainly okay with their cousins, their Arabic brothers, the Germans, who assisted them in one massacre after another. And continue to support the Turks by giving Kurds and other people that the NATO has said, well, they brought them all their crappy guns that didn't work, that they had in storage for 50 years, and gave it to all the Kurds. It's really a disgrace, but that's what the Germans do. And of course, the Germans don't make anything. One of their finest gun manufacturers has just been found to be so fraudulent because the guns don't work. German gun manufacturers, and they can't even build guns that shoot straight. So this is very typical. So of all the fraud perpetrated by the criminal Deutsches. So we need to understand that the Russians and the Germans were just competing gangs. Does everybody get that? That we're both basically socialists with a little bit of spin to it, because one was more of a upper class socialism. But communism, as it is known today and was instituted, certainly wasn't the system that Marx or anybody else had in mind. It turned into an elite system of the people at the top lived like Western rich people, and everybody else was given a certain low standard. Now, the basic understanding of the socialistic Nazis was the fact that there was a warrior class and everybody else was scum. Kings and warriors and merchants and everybody else were scumbuckets. So it's kind of the same thing, except the Russians would call the other scumbuckets the people. So you need to understand that. So after a while there, of course, after going to Russia and toasting that they were brothers and everything else. Now Russia was founded by the Rusk, which was a Scandinavian tribe of Nordics, and of course they have a history where they've been invaded by the Mongols and everything else. So they're kind of a strange combination of people, but certainly they are more quote white in general, and they're called the White Russians, and have that heritage of Nordics, while the Germans have heritage of Iran. So, and of course, if you look at the history of Persia and Iran, they're the most violent, disgusting people ever on the planet, and have murdered, to this day, they continue to murder the most people on the planet other than China. That's the heritage you're getting. Are you surprised with that? Now, this whole thing, which you think is an issue that was thrown in front of you, and of course, this was done by basically the Arab elite who ran Nazism, all the freaks, weirdos, and homosexuals that made up Nazis. All the people who were basically failures, like Himmler, who was a failed chicken farmer. That's his background, a chicken farmer. Little no-chin, little weasel who never could get a date, and who probably was homosexual. Even though he persecuted homosexuals, and they murdered thousands, tens of thousands of homosexuals that were SS, and others, because they had such a problem, because Germany is such a homosexual country. So the Germans are notorious for jacking each other off in combat and constantly doing this stuff, and that, of course, went further and further. And the battle for Leningrad has been estimated that 30% of those people killed there were found in homosexual postures that were killed by the Russians. That's how they were found. And of course, 70% of the casualties were shot in the back because they were running. These are facts. So the whole idea is that this is the reality of what's going on there. So they were fighting the competing blood tribe, and they were the Crips. Not a big deal. And who were their buddies? Well, people seem to forget that dictator in Spain, I believe it was Franco, was a huge supporter. And they were sending them arms. Most of the Nazis relocated there and escaped through Spain. And, of course, the weak-kneed American commanders, led by Nazi Patton, allowed this to happen. Eisenhower was very weak and just wanted to get things over with and come home. A big mistake, because everything repeats itself. So you had that. But also Romania. Romania has oil. There were other people that were. Finland, which had nickel. They went in there and bought them off, and the Finns joined the Nazi party, and Britain actually declared war on them. So there's many others that were working with them directly or into it. Now, Spain was supposed to be neutral, and Turkey was supposed to be neutral. But you got to remember, all these, Spain was, Turkey fought with the Germans, part of the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Islamic Empire of the Ottomans, which stretched over, because that's who basically was running the Ottoman Empire, were the allies in World War I of the Germans. Do you think that changed 20 years later, or even less than that? You're talking about 5 years, really, when everything was starting. Do you really think that changed? And, of course, the Spanish, who Hitler bombed the Basque and other people, all were big supporters of. They had troops, and let's not forget Italy, who the idiot Mussolini got himself trapped in conditions and went to Satan for help, and find out what he got from that. His whole country got destroyed, and he got hung. He was having problems in Africa and needed help, and only the Germans would help them, and of course help Spain with their Basque problem. They used to test their weapons on the Basque and other people in Spain, new weapons, and of course this is where they bombed. What a great thing to have some place you can destroy that isn't yours, and you have this great friend of yours. But they allowed the Spanish to go as well, while the Russians wanted to take Spain. The other one, of course, is and they're all dictators who have murdered millions of people. Ceausescu, let's not forget him, of Romania. So, So you're talking about all these countries. It's not just this Deutschland against everybody else. And of course, you can go through different countries there as well. I'm sure there's some I'm forgetting and have left out here. And let's not forget the murderous Japanese who murdered 20 million Chinese alone in World War II in the most brutal ways and tortured everybody they got to death, being the charming little radio and car makers. So all of this is something to fully understand of this is how the world looks, and this is what World War II is about. This is not just Deutschland, otherwise named as Germany, fighting the rest of the world. It's not the case at all. Secondly, they were very battle hardened, and when they fought people like the Polish, who had virtually no mechanized, you got to remember World War II had an awful lot of on horseback fighting to it as well. And the point is that the Polish had absolutely nothing when the Germans ran in with their tanks and annihilated them. So we need to understand that. And of course, there's very bizarre reasons or even strange belief systems that the Germans, who really aren't that smart, had set of these advanced technologies. There is a lot of rumors, as bizarre as it may sound, that they somehow got captured alien crafts and reversed engineered them, or were getting information even from some hostile extraterrestrial groups. Who were too inept to assist them to win the war, apparently, or there's talk they pulled out after seeing that they couldn't win. They were backing the loser, and the aliens weren't going to continue to do that. So we need to understand that. You've got to understand that Britain, of course, has never been any kind of power. Now, the problem with the British is that a lot of them are Germans. And Hitler didn't want to attack Britain as much because they were brothers. Again, they think they're brothers, but the point is they are to a degree. So the point is the English tend to be Germanic Arabs. And of course, there were battles with the Normans who tried to take England and, from what I understand, lost, who were the Nordics, who came Normandy, otherwise Norway of France, and of course with others. So there was all these things coming from what you consider the Nordics, the Anglo-Saxons, which are generally more of the Scandinavians, against the British, who are basically mostly German Arabs. And you can see that in their racial structure as well. So you have all these countries, and this is going on. And of course, after World War I, nobody really wanted to fight again so quickly, but they were forced to as they were taking everything. Of course, Hitler said Poland attacked them. The same old story. We hear that all the time. The same old thing going on. So all that stuff happened, and they didn't have a chance in hell to win the war long term, no matter what they did. And you certainly can't hold vast areas of territory. It's just about impossible, even using the highly brutal and mass murder tactics that the Germans are known for. Butchering hundreds of people. They killed thousands of Italians who didn't want the Germans in there. And again, this issue of the Jews is where they come from. The Germans were well aware that they were Jews, that they were Arabs. And how are they going to finance their war? Well, they're going to finance their war by raping the rich. Wherever they go, there was a huge population of wealthy people, and these were Jewish. The Jewish people are very good businessmen, highly educated, and were forced out of working for others because people didn't want to hire Jews. So what this caused was doing that with a smart group of people is setting yourself up for problems. So they became merchants and traders, and they were wealthy. So every place they went to with their, let's not forget Hungary, their buddies, they went in there and murdered all the Jews and took their money. Because you can't fight a war without money. So it had absolutely nothing to do, but you have to demonize people if you're going to kill them and take their money. So they made up all this nonsense when they were fully aware that they themselves, and by the way, when you have I've recently had my personal genetics checked, and there is no German genetics. They're called Jewish. Stasi Jews, that's what Germans are. So there isn't even a German genetic background. They all come from the Middle East. Check it out, people. Grow up, learn, and get the facts. Particularly you dumb, stupid white racists. So the whole idea is that all of this is fact. So it's a complicated issue, and it isn't. So the whole idea is when you don't finish things like in World War I, you're going to get problems after that. Now this is a country that murdered an entire generation. They should have been completely overrun. Everybody in the populace should have been moved out of that country into other places. The language should have been stopped. Everything should have been turned over to the Allied forces and broken up the country into other countries taken over by those who fought and who were owed billions and who lost an entire generation of men in a very, I don't know if there's any good wars, but trench warfare is one step, if you can even say a step above, basic combat of the Middle Ages. I mean, you're talking about people fought in the trenches with knives and axes and Middle Age weapons. That's what it got down to. Hand-to-hand Middle Age, medieval weapons. So we ought to got to keep that in mind here. So when you allow that to happen, and you allow a race who has since its inception, and of course Germany wasn't even a country until I always forget, is that 18 something, just before the turn of the 19th century, or was it 70? But the point is they're only about 150 years old as a country. Before that, they were diverse tribes, and like the Visigoths, which was the Western Germans who ran into Spain and then surrendered to their Muslim cousins, allowing them to take Spain. And we'll go into that history as well here. That is the situation there. So people don't understand that's how the things look. And of course, Britain was very weak. France was very weak. Nobody really wanted to fight again, and they didn't want to fight again because they never finished the first war. And if you don't go in and destroy your enemies, you have that problem, and that's exactly what happened. So even with all that, the homeless loser painter Adolf Hitler, who was a coward in World War I, who after being a messenger and getting badly wounded, decided he couldn't see. He couldn't go back to battle because he couldn't see. So, this was his lie, so he never returned. The guy had told everybody else to die for their country. And all the other false generals like Rommel and everybody else who died as a coward committing suicide. All the things that is very typical and what you don't know is the reality of what's going on with all of these people. So looking at that, that's exactly what happened. So, of course, when it suited the Germans, thinking that they could, in their egotistical way, move pretty, because, the West was beaten. Nobody was coming from Britain to harass them. The French were under their control with the Vichy government. All of Europe was taken over. Holland was neutral, and they invaded them. And to the Dutch's credit, they put up a good fight when they got invaded and delayed the Germans from taking a lot more ground by fighting back. So a little tip of the glass to them. Other people, of course, Switzerland was neutral. They invaded all of Scandinavia. The Finns, of course, couldn't wait to join them because they didn't like the Russians. But, of course, this is even at the end of the war, they had no problem fighting for the Nazis, and everybody knew the atrocities they were doing. But that's kind of a bend-over country. So the whole idea is they invaded Norway. I'm not sure if Sweden was invaded or not. I know they tended to be neutral, but I don't think so in that war. And, of course, Switzerland was neutral, and they needed them for the banks. But pretty much everybody else, whether they were neutral or not, was taken over. So all these little countries and everything else are meaningless. Belgium, other places, whether there was any kind of resistance is unimportant. They're tiny little countries. So the whole idea is that you have these kind of things that go on, and you got to understand how the war went. So you got this giant country who's feeding troops and everything else, and there was a lot of Turkish troops that were fighting with the Germans as well, in German uniforms. There's lots of pictures of them sitting there. The great Aryans, well, of course they are Aryans, but the great, quote, Caucasian Turks in SS uniforms when they murdered the guy across the street because he had a lot of money in the bank. So, and let's remember what was done here. People were taken out of their homes, robbed, raped, and people forget about all these little things, like the witch of Auschwitz, who shrunk heads, and everybody knew it and thought it was fun. She took tattoos off of live people by cutting them off, not to mention the mass rape and torture. And when babies came into Auschwitz, the German shepherds were trained to rip them apart. Oh, let's get some beer and little pants and dance around. Ooh. So the whole idea is that this is the kind of people that you're dealing with. And of course, the weak-kneed Americans allowed this scum based on the fantasy that Russia was a big problem. We should have been making friends with the Russians. Russia fought in World War II and won that war. They beat 129 German divisions were in the East. In the West, 20 German divisions, because they didn't need much more to take care of them scone eaters and the give me some French bread, and Patton, I'm with you, Hitler. So this is the kind of resistance that was in the West. So they didn't put very many people there. So, of course, there were some good American commanders, and of course Eisenhower tried, but he was too much of a corporate guy and not enough of a warrior. And of course Bradley and others. But we have the other weakling, MacArthur, who just turned over the Philippines to the Japanese and really never fought back. You gotta really wonder what's going on with the United States military. And then, of course, you want to trust them today. So the whole idea is that there was nothing coming from the West. The East was weird. Now, there was a big fight there, and of course, the Russians had over 2 million men waiting in arms. They could have never won that battle, even if they were able to win in Stalingrad, which ultimately they didn't. There's no way they could have done it. The Russians had so many men, and they could have never been able to take Russia, period. But of course, that's the egotistical thing, and of course, Hitler said he wanted every of the Germans to fight to the death in Stalingrad, and what they did was run back home as quick as they could. And they were in retreat of the 4 or 5 years that this war went on, the Germans were in retreat for 3 of those years. So it was inevitable. And of course, allowing this to happen to the degree it did, was the West allowed it to happen because they couldn't really fight anyway. I mean, they really were no match for some of the technology, and of course there wasn't enough of them. But the point is, 120 divisions compared to 20 divisions. What do you think if the West would have met 100 German divisions in the different areas? Well, that war would have went on for many, many years longer. Not that they could have ever won, but there would have been a lot more casualties, and of course, we would have forgot about them anyway, too. So, okay, bunch of let's buy their cars and let these guys dance around and continue to take over the world with their banks instead of tanks. Like the Finns do. $150 million they owe to the Nazis. And they're a great little society. Goo, goo, goo. So the whole idea is that this is the kind of things that continue to go on in this world. And it is furthered by everybody dropping to their knees because the Germans have taken out credit cards and said, you can spend money, but you need to pay it back. Oh, don't worry about that. Like everybody does with credit cards. Oh, you spend it today, and yeah, you worry about paying it back next month. And when the bills start to come, it starts to get impossible to pay. Exact same thing. That's what the EU is all about. The EU is about giving people lots of credit cards that they can't pay back and making them your slaves. Like they do in Finland, where they sell huge amounts of goods to the Finnish and buy very little, as they do all around the world. That's how Germans work. So all of this happened as this big battle here, and of course, if it wasn't for the Russians, that war would have gone on for another 10 years, easily, because you don't really have anybody that can do anything. Britain never was a very serious power. They did prove their guts in the Battle of Britain, where the Spitfire, which was invented by the Brits and made by them, kicked the ass of the Luftwaffe. And they ran back in their proper little baby blue uniforms with their makeup on, Goering, that great macho man. He ran back and cried, "Ooh, we can't take Britain with aeroplanes." And of course, they couldn't do it at Dunkirk either. I mean, the Luftwaffe is one of the most incompetent air forces there ever was, and continue to keep that pride going today. Certainly, Europe will be defended to the last American body. So the whole idea is that that's how the world works. So the point is they never had a chance. They never could do anything. They could never really, even though they had plans of invading Britain, this would have been very difficult to do, especially when the Americans arrived, not because of anything more than the fact that America is a huge industrial power. It has back then it probably had 250 million people and lots of industrial power. No way of getting attacked too easily, even though what's interesting is the Nazis were building a giant embassy in the Hollywood Hills, and of course they had built planes to go on and bomb the United States. This was on there, but that would have been very difficult with the technology of those days, and probably would have never been able to put enough in the air to do anything. Now, the Germans did attack off the coast of Florida in particular with their subfleet for a short period of time, but they were never able to sustain that because they never really had anything. And ultimately, German technology was pretty pathetic when it really came down to it. A lot of on the plans, a lot of wanna-dos, wanna-can, but when it really came down to it, they didn't put too much out there. They did kill 60,000 British civilians with the bombings of London and the rest of Europe. 60,000 in that period of time. Now, we lost 60,000 men in Vietnam over 10 years, and those were military people mostly. 60,000. And the little red-haired bastard of that worthless Diane walks around in Nazi uniforms on 2 occasions, by the way. Well, Daddy's a Nazi. Why shouldn't you be one? The whole family is Nazis. So that's where their heritage comes from. And, of course, they have the big ears and big nose to show their true background coming from Arabic countries. That's the fact of it. That's their genetic traits. So the whole idea is that's very important to understand that progress of that. What went on in World War II? What are the countries involved? What were the situations? How was that war won? Well, the war was not won by Americans, French, or British. It was won by the Russians. If the Germans would have beaten the Russians and turned those 120 divisions towards the west, well, as I said, that war would have went on for many, many years longer. Plain and simple. So, regardless of what people want to think about the charming, brutal Russians, and of course, Stalin was a real treasure with all his mass murder of people, but that's what you do to take your country back as well. You get rid of the subversives. There's a lot of ways of looking at things, and if you want to control things, that's what you need to do. Was he supposed to turn that over to the pseudo-intellectual Nazi-influenced? Were those people supposed to live? Well, you can look at things a lot. So, certainly. But we should have been working with Russians, trying to control their mass murder, and taking the countries we should have. Turkey, Spain, Romania. These countries should have been taken with the help of the Russians and put under a national European government. The real EU, ran by those people who were attacked by that. Ran by the Russians, the French, the British, and the Americans. Plain and simple. That's what the Europe should look like today. Plain and simple. That was not done, so we have problems. I mean, Franco stayed in power in Spain until I believe the 70s. I'm not entirely sure, until he was overthrown. And we need to go back even further in history to understand, well, what is this German bloodline? Where does this come from? Who are these people? And interesting enough, there isn't a single, quote, white country that the Germans align themselves with or in any way did not attack. Every single, quote, white country the Germans attacked. The French, the British, the Dutch, you name it, they attacked them. Who did not they attack? The Arabs. The Spanish, who you could say, well, are they white? Well, we'll get into whom they are in other lectures. The Romanians, All the people that they attacked, every single, quote, white country, Poland, we can go on and on and on, all of Eastern Europe, that they attacked and mass murdered everybody. So if you want to think that somehow these were people that they weren't anything about except being Aryan Arabs and siding with other Arabs, even distant Arabs like the Spanish and the unfortunately Romanians. These are all basically people that have Arab heritage. And I will discuss this in other lectures. People don't seem to understand that anyway. So the whole idea is they've always been working in this federation together. Now, the federation broke up when the Germans attacked the Russians, breaking their treaty. So then the federation broke up. And thank God, because if they would have put all those people together, the Russians would have easily taken all of Europe and could hold it today with the military force they had. I mean, the Germans lost so much ground after Stalingrad, it isn't even funny. And of course, the Russians took pretty much 3/4 of Germany and made them their slaves, which is what we should have done to them as well. Set up because of the hostilities created by people like the Nazi Patton, created these hostilities so we couldn't work with the Russians. But you know, there's a long history there. And we got to remember that it also was a German who stole the nuclear bomb plans and gave it to the Russians. It just never ends of the joy we get from the Deutschlanders. It just never ends. They terrorized the world right down to 1776 when the British brought in their cousins, the Hessians or Germans, as troops into America to butcher the Americans. And the Hessians were known for rape and murder and theft, and were specifically mentioned in the peace settlement that you get those guys out of here. Very interesting. And of course, the British themselves were very brutal to the Americans, who they looked down as kind of dogs. I'm not sure you can say it, more like insects to be stomped on and laughed at. But of course, they saw the Hessians, the Germans, as their buddies. So, of course, continued right up to this day, and of course, apparently, a good percentage of the British population has woken up to this fact to get out of the Nazi EU and to have their own freedom and not be under the dictates of a bunch of countries that have different values, dramatically different values. These dramatically different values between the continental Europe and Britain's interests, who's being flooded with all sorts of problems. And thank God they kept their own money and decided not to be, the little bendovers like places all over Europe did. Greece, Finland, all the people who jumped into it to be part of the Nazi support system. But you got to remember, these people supported the Nazis before, so it's not really much difference for these countries to join the Nazis now. What's the difference? They were part of it. There's not a single country that supported the Nazis that is not in the EU. Plain and simple. That ought to tell you something right from the beginning. Now, economic agreements make a lot of sense. Business agreements, not social agreements, not money agreements. You don't give somebody your wallet. You don't give up your right to control your borders, and you don't give up your money. And that's what the EU is all about. The EU is about letting everybody flow back and forth to the borders and, of course, having one central control over the money, which is complete madness. Except for those, but of course the EU is what, hey, we make it whatever we want, hey, we are Danish, we keep our own money. We're Brits, we keep our own money. So it goes on and on with these kind of things where some keep money, some don't. What does all that mean? Well, that's a fake union. And of course, bringing in countries that have no industry like Bulgaria and Romania and so forth. But of course, they do have commodities that the German needs, and those are prostitutes. And lots of them. So the whole idea is that's why they're part of the EU, the icky union. So the whole idea is that all of that is what's going on right now. And how does this affect today? Well, you got to understand how those things affect, and we'll get more into this Islamic cooperation and what they have been supported, particularly by the Doors, and who are the Spanish and other people? What was their cultures about? What happened? Well, it's kind of interesting how this Islamic Federation has affected the world through their conquering of all sorts of countries. And I don't think people understand that. There seems to be, and we'll get into that in the next lecture, a great misunderstanding of the fact that somehow Islam is the victim of the European or Americans who have invaded their countries. That somehow the Middle East, and particularly Jerusalem, was somehow an Arabic place because it's located in the Middle East. Well, that's very interesting and kind of a misnomer and a misunderstanding of what the world was like hundreds and hundreds of years ago, and even is today. It seems to be perfectly fine that the Turkish have taken over the Rome of its time and occupied that country for hundreds and hundreds of years. That's perfectly fine. But someone who was 500 years earlier claim on Jerusalem and who own that doesn't have a right to go back there and take their land back from the Seljuk Turks who stole it and murdered all the people there. That's perfectly fine. So you got to get your history straight, people. And again, check me out. You don't believe what I'm telling you? Go ahead and read it for yourself. So that's the end of part 1. We'll pick up in part 2 whenever.